The sky was bleeding. Thick crimson clouds swirled above Hollowbrook. An isolated town nestled between vast, unyielding mountains. The air smelled of copper and rain, and the townspeople whispered in hushed voices about the storm that was coming. Ezra Holloway, a 27-year-old journalist, had arrived that afternoon. He wasn't here for the storm. He was here for a story, a decades-old local legend that had resurfaced with fresh horror. The Bloodstorm. According to town records, it had only happened once before, on the night of October 12th, 1893. That night, every single resident of Hollowbrook had vanished without a trace, leaving behind empty homes, untouched meals, and streets soaked in what appeared to be blood. No bodies, no signs of struggle, just the storm and the disappearance. Now, the sky was turning red again. Ezra checked his phone. No signal. He looked out of his motel window, watching the storm clouds gather over the mountains. It wasn't just rain. The clouds moved unnaturally, almost like they were alive, twisting and writhing like something trying to break free. A knock at his door. He hesitated before opening it. On the other side stood Margaret Alden, the town's librarian and historian. An old woman, frail but sharp-eyed, gripping a leather-bound book wrapped in cloth. Her hands trembled as she pushed it toward him. "You need to leave, Mr. Holloway. Tonight?" Ezra frowned. "Why? Because of the storm?" Margaret's eyes darted toward the window. Something moved in the sky. "Because it's not a storm." Ezra unwrapped the book. Inside were brittle, yellowed pages filled with frantic handwriting, sketches of shadowy figures, and a repeating phrase scrawled in red ink. "They come with the storm. They want the blood." A sudden gust of wind slammed against the motel, rattling the windows. A low hum filled the air, like distant whispers layered over one another. Ezra shivered. "What happened in 1893? He asked. Margaret swallowed hard. "They didn't leave. They were taken." A loud crack echoed through the town. The lights flickered. Ezra rushed to the window, just in time to see the first drop of red rain hit the glass. It trickled down slowly, thick, viscous, and unmistakably blood. From somewhere in the distance, a scream cut through the air. The bloodstorm had begun. The first scream didn't stop. It stretched through the night like a blade carving through silence. Ezra's pulse quickened as he peered through the rain-streaked window. The streets of Hollowbrook were almost deserted, except for one figure standing beneath the flickering streetlights. It was a man, but something was wrong. His body was rigid, head tilted back unnaturally, as if an unseen force was pulling him upward. His mouth hung open in a silent scream, and from his eyes, ears, and nostrils, thin streams of blood ran down his face. Ezra took a step back from the window, his breath quickening. Margaret clutched his wrist. "We need to stay inside. If we go out there, we're as good as dead." But then, another scream. This time, closer. Ezra moved toward the door. "Someone needs help." Margaret grabbed his arm, her grip surprisingly strong for someone her age. "You don't understand. The bloodstorm doesn't just bring rain. It brings them. Before she could answer, a shadow passed by the window. Ezra froze. It wasn't a person. It was something tall, thin, and moving in an unnatural way. Its limbs stretched too long, its movements jittery, as if flickering in and out of existence. The dim streetlight illuminated a twisted face, hollow eyes that were too black, absorbing all the light around them. It turned its head sharply as if hearing something. Then it snapped its gaze directly to Ezra. A deep, gut-wrenching hum filled the air. Margaret yanked him away from the window. "Don't let them see you. If they see you, they won't stop." The humming grew louder. More shadows emerged from the darkened streets, their spindly bodies twisting and shifting with every step. Then, a single knock on the motel door. 1, 2, 3, slow, deliberate, not human. Ezra's breath hitched. He backed away, heart hammering. Margaret pressed her palm over his mouth, silencing him. The knocking stopped. For a moment, only the sound of the storm remained. The heavy, wet splatter of blood rain against the rooftop. The distant crackling of lightning. Then, scraping. Something dragging its nails down the door. Ezra clenched his fists. The air in the room felt heavy, thick, like something unseen was pressing against his chest. A whisper slithered through the keyhole. "Come outside." The voice was wrong, layered, distorted, as if 100 voices spoke at once. Margaret shook her head furiously, mouthing, "Don't answer." Ezra felt his body tense. The air was charged, the atmosphere thick with an unseen presence. The storm outside intensified, the wind howling as if it carried the voices of the dead. Then suddenly, a loud crash came from upstairs. Margaret's face drained of color. "Someone else is here." Ezra grabbed a rusty fireplace poker from the corner of the room. His hands trembled, but he forced himself to steady them. They climbed the creaky wooden staircase, each step slow and deliberate. At the top, a long hallway stretched before them, lined with old motel doors, some slightly ajar. A flickering light bulb buzzed above them. Then, another sound. Drip, drip, drip. Ezra looked down. A small puddle was forming on the wooden floor. Dark red, the ceiling above them was leaking. Something thick and warm. Then a soft chuckle. Ezra's stomach clenched. From the end of the hall, one of the doors slowly creaked open. Inside the room, something shifted. Something waiting. Then, the light bulb above them burst. The hall was plunged into darkness, and the whispering began again. "Come outside." The hallway was suffocating in its darkness. The only light came from the blood-red storm outside, seeping through the thin curtains of the open motel room at the far end. Ezra's grip tightened around the fireplace poker as he stepped forward. The air smelled metallic, thick with something wrong, not just blood, but decay. Margaret's whisper barely broke the silence. "We shouldn't be here." But Ezra couldn't turn back. Something had moved in that room. As they inched closer, the whispering shifted. It no longer came from outside. It was inside the motel. "We see you." Ezra's breath hitched. A shadow passed behind the doorframe. Someone was inside, or something. He pushed the door open with the poker, the hinges creaking loudly. The room was a wreck. Furniture overturned, deep claw marks scraped across the wooden floorboards. The walls were covered in dark handprints, smeared and frantic. The window was open, the blood rain dripping onto the carpet, pooling near the bed. And then Ezra saw it. The mirror. It hung on the wall, cracked down the middle, distorting the reflection. But inside the glass, there was someone standing in the room. A tall figure, unnaturally thin, its face blurred like a smudged painting. It wasn't in the room, only in the reflection. Ezra turned around sharply. Nothing. But in the mirror, the figure moved closer. Its head twitched, its limbs jerking unnaturally as it took slow, deliberate steps toward them. Ezra stumbled back. Margaret gasped. The thing inside the mirror tilted its head, And suddenly, the lights flickered back on. For a moment, there was silence. Then, a loud, shattering crash. The mirror exploded outward, shards flying in every direction. Margaret screamed as a sliver of glass cut across her cheek. Ezra shielded his face, his heart hammering. When he looked up, the figure was gone. Only the sound of heavy breathing remained. Not his. Something was inside the room now. A low, guttural growl rumbled from the corner. Slowly, Ezra turned his head. The closet door was ajar. Inside, something shifted. Margaret grabbed his arm, yanking him back. "We have to run." But Ezra couldn't move. His body locked in place as two long, bony fingers curled around the edge of the closet door. Then, a hand emerged. Wrong. Too many joints. Too many fingers. Its nails scraped the wood, slow and deliberate. Ezra's body finally reacted. He grabbed Margaret and bolted. They raced down the hallway, the whispering turning into shrieking. A sound so high-pitched, so unnatural, it rattled inside their skulls. Ezra didn't dare look back. He didn't need to. He could feel it following them, something crawling. Not running, not walking, crawling, faster than it should be able to move. The motel door was just ahead. Ezra reached for the handle. Bang! The door slammed shut on its own. Margaret grabbed his wrist. "The storm! It's keeping us in!" Ezra turned, chest heaving. The hallway stretched unnaturally, the walls twisting, bending like something alive. Then the lights flickered again. For a single moment, Ezra saw dozens of them, figures standing in the darkness, watching, waiting, their hollow eyes locked onto him. The lights went out. A whisper brushed against his ear. "We are here." Then, a hand grabbed his wrist, but it wasn't Margaret's. It was ice cold. Ezra's breath came in ragged gasps as he and Margaret staggered down the hallway. The world around them was warping, twisting, unreal. Every inch of the motel seemed to pulse with a horrible, unnatural energy. The walls, the floor, the ceiling, they were all alive, breathing with a slow, steady rhythm. Ezra felt like he was being suffocated by the atmosphere itself. What was happening? Suddenly, the air shifted. A chill washed over him. He could see his breath, misty and cold, in front of him. Then a screech. A terrible, bone-shaking shriek came from behind them. Ezra spun around, but he saw nothing. A low, rhythmic humming echoed through the halls. It came from all around them, vibrating the air. It was like an ancient song, one that had been forgotten by time, but never lost. The melody felt wrong, as if it were trying to invade their minds, twist their very thoughts. Margaret's voice broke through the haze of fear. "We need to find the basement." Ezra stared at her, confused. "The basement? What's down there?" Margaret's eyes widened, and her voice dropped to a whisper. "It's the only way to stop it. The things, they can't get to us there. Not yet." Ezra felt his heart race. They? Who were they? What were they talking about? Margaret grabbed his hand and pulled him toward the stairs. But before they could reach the staircase, a cold, gusting wind slammed into them, forcing them back against the walls. Ezra cried out as the force of the wind cracked the windows around them. The entire building shuddered as if it were about to collapse. And then he saw it. Through the cracks in the glass, he saw the storm. It wasn't just rain. It was something else. Swirling clouds of dark red, casting an eerie glow across the sky. The clouds seemed to move with purpose. They weren't just hanging there. They were shifting, seeking, as if something inside them was waiting to break free. Ezra felt a sinking dread rise in his chest. This was no normal storm. Suddenly, the front door to the motel slammed open, creaking on its hinges. A figure stood in the doorway, outlined by the dim light of the blood-red sky. Ezra froze. The figure was tall, its body too thin, its skin stretched too tightly over its bones. Its face was like a mask, smooth and featureless, save for empty, hollow eyes. The figure took a step forward, its limbs jerking in unnatural movements. Another step. Ezra's legs felt like lead, but he managed to stagger back, pulling Margaret with him. Then the humming stopped. A voice, smooth and cold, echoed in the air. "You cannot hide. You cannot escape." The sound vibrated inside Ezra's skull, and he doubled over, clutching his head. The pain was unbearable. Margaret screamed, shaking him. "Ezra, fight it!" But he couldn't. The pain, the words. They were too much. A vision flashed before his eyes. A burning sky, the storm, creatures, more of them. Emerging from the clouds, their bodies made of shadow and light. They were waiting, watching, hungry. Then another voice. This one softer, gentler, but still filled with terror. The storm was never meant to come here. The door was meant to stay closed. Ezra's head snapped up. His vision cleared for a moment. In front of him, standing in the doorway, was a woman. She was drenched in blood, her clothes torn, her face gaunt as if starved. But there was something familiar about her. "Who are you?" Ezra gasped. The woman opened her mouth, but before she could speak, the lights flickered again. A deep, echoing crack reverberated through the motel. Ezra turned around. The mirror in the hallway was glowing, pulsing. The woman's voice shook. "They're coming. The door is open." And then, the storm outside seemed to break free. From the cracks in the walls, from the cracks in the sky, they began to emerge. Figures, more of them, tall, skeletal, their movements jerking and twitching, their faces twisted and blank. Their bodies were bound in dark, rotting skin, as though they had been born from something ancient, long forgotten. Their eyes were voids, drawing in every ounce of light, every ounce of life. Ezra's heart stopped. They were everywhere. In the corners of the motel, on the walls. They were watching. The woman grabbed Ezra by the shoulders, shaking him violently. "You have to listen to me. You have to get to the basement now." Before Ezra could respond, the creature in the doorway moved again. It was faster this time. Too fast. It lurched toward the woman, its jaws snapping. She screamed, but before it could reach her, a blinding light erupted from the basement door. It wasn't natural. It wasn't from any source they could see. It was just there. The light was bright enough to cut through the darkness. And for the briefest of moments, the creatures flinched, their movements stilled. Ezra grabbed Margaret's hand and pulled her toward the light. The basement door slammed open, just as the creature lunged. Screams echoed through the motel. They didn't look back. They couldn't. Down the stairs, they ran, not daring to stop. The light from the basement door illuminated their path, but they knew it wouldn't last. They had to get inside. They had to close it. As they reached the basement, Ezra's heart stopped. The door was already open. A low hum came from the darkness. They could hear the faintest whisper. "Welcome." Ezra's stomach churned. This was no place of safety. It was a prison. A place to trap them, to trap everyone. But they had no choice. They stepped inside, and as the door closed behind them, they heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate, and coming closer. The storm was only just beginning. The basement door slammed shut behind Ezra and Margaret with a loud clang, and the world seemed to collapse around them. The faint hum from the other side of the door faded, replaced by an oppressive silence. Ezra's heart raced in his chest, the only sound the frantic beats of his own pulse. They stood in the dark, surrounded by a creeping chill that seemed to seep from the very walls. The air was thick with something unseen, heavy with dread and the lingering stench of decay. Ezra glanced at Margaret. Her face was pale, and her hands shook violently. But there was a grim resolve in her eyes. She hadn't spoken since they entered the basement. And Ezra knew she was grappling with the same fear that he was. The fear that they may never leave this place. Margaret moved first, her footsteps slow and deliberate. She walked to a small table in the far corner of the room, where a few old candles flickered weakly, their flames casting long shadows across the stone walls. Ezra followed her, every muscle tense, ready for anything, but nothing prepared him for what lay ahead. In the corner of the basement, there was a blackened mirror, cracked and weathered by time. Its surface so dull it seemed to absorb the very light, but as Ezra approached it, a faint glow began to emanate from within. It was a cold, ghostly light, pale blue, almost sickly in its intensity. Margaret's breath hitched when she saw the mirror. "It's starting," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "We don't have much time." Ezra didn't understand. What was starting? What did the mirror have to do with the storm? He was about to ask when a low, guttural voice echoed from the shadows behind them. "You think you can escape?" Ezra whipped around, but the basement was empty. There was no one there. Nothing but the blackness and the shadows that clung to the corners of the room. "There is no escaping the storm," the voice continued, this time louder, and it seemed to come from everywhere. "Once it begins, it never ends. The storm will claim you, just as it claimed them." Ezra's chest tightened. The voice, it sounded so familiar. He looked at Margaret. Her eyes were wide with terror, but there was something else there too. Recognition. She knew something he didn't. Margaret's fingers curled into fists, and she turned toward the mirror. "I told you," she said, almost to herself. "I told you the storm had no mercy." Ezra tried to make sense of her words, but before he could speak, the glowing mirror suddenly shattered with an ear-splitting crack. The pieces didn't fall to the floor. Instead, they floated, suspended in midair, swirling in a vortex of dark energy that seemed to stretch out of time itself. Ezra stepped back, heart pounding. A terrifying howl filled the air, vibrating the walls and causing the very ground beneath them to rumble. The temperature dropped even further, and the breath caught in Ezra's throat as he looked up. The mirror's reflection had changed. Instead of their own faces staring back at them, dark shapes moved within the shards, figures that were not human, things, nightmarish things, their twisted limbs contorted in ways that defied logic, their features masked by dark veils of shadow. The air began to hum again, the ominous melody creeping into Ezra's ears. And as the first notes of the haunting song filled the room, the floor beneath their feet shuddered. "They're coming," Margaret said, her voice trembling. "We have to close the door before it's too late." Ezra wanted to argue, to demand what she meant by closing the door. But the words caught in his throat. He turned back to the swirling mirror, and in that instant, a terrible presence descended upon them. An overwhelming feeling of hunger. The lights flickered, the temperature plummeted, and Ezra's breath came out in frosty clouds. Shadows began to stretch toward them, creeping along the walls like tendrils of smoke. It was as if the very darkness itself had come alive, drawn to the mirror's shattered reflection. Ezra grabbed Margaret's arm. "Where's the door? What are you talking about?" he demanded. Margaret's eyes met his, wide and fearful. "The basement is the door. We've opened it now, and we can't shut it until we stop the storm." Ezra's mind raced. How could a basement be a door? It didn't make sense. None of this made sense. And yet, he knew in his bones that Margaret was right. Something dark and ancient had been awakened. The storm wasn't just a storm. It was a gate. Suddenly, the walls began to pulse. Rocks cracked, the mortar between them grinding as if something was pushing through. The air was thick with a presence so powerful that Ezra could hardly breathe. The storm was no longer just outside. It was inside, and it was pressing in on them. Margaret's voice came again, low and trembling. "We need to find the seal, the one that holds it back." Ezra's eyes darted around the room. A seal? Where? Where could they find it? Before he could ask, a sound filled the air. A low, guttural growl. And then the shadows lunged. Tendrils of darkness like writhing snakes shot out from the walls, coiling toward them with terrifying speed. Ezra yanked Margaret back, but one of the tendrils wrapped around his leg, pulling him to the floor. He screamed, the force of the shadow constricting like a vice, squeezing the life out of him. Margaret cried out, but the tendril was too powerful. It was dragging him into the swirling vortex of the broken mirror, its edges glowing red-hot, as if it were a portal into something far worse than the storm itself. "No!" Margaret screamed, her hands flying to Ezra's. She pulled with all her strength, but the shadow held fast, dragging him toward the vortex inch by inch. Ezra's vision blurred, the weight of the shadow pressing on his chest. The growl intensified, now joined by a high-pitched screech, as if something was fighting to break free from the depths of the storm. Ezra looked into Margaret's eyes, desperate. "Find the seal," he gasped. "I'll hold it off. Just find the seal." Margaret nodded, tears streaking down her face. She sprinted toward the far corner of the basement, where an old bookcase stood, its wooden frame dusty and warped. Without a second thought, she began to pull the books down, her hands trembling as she searched for something, anything, to stop the nightmare. Ezra's vision darkened. The tendril was tightening around his throat now. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't think. He was being pulled into the mirror, into the darkness, but then he heard it. The sound of paper, torn and flipped through. Margaret's voice, faint but clear, called out, "I found it." She was holding something. A small ancient book, bound in leather, its pages yellowed with age. The seal, the one that could stop this nightmare. Ezra's vision faded as the shadows consumed him. But as everything went black, he heard the unmistakable sound of a page turning. And then nothing.